what happens is it gets used over and over again, so that suddenly, the media, whoever this third force person is doing the job for the media for them, because they're making the people who look into the secondary part of an event when it happens look foolish by placing this third force really far out story in there. So that's something that needs to be identified and halted in a sense, because then there's no way that we're going to get to the real deal when these stories happen if we have this whole functioning process out there. And obviously it's very well funded, because you open up your Facebook and boom, 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 there it is. So the third force activity, the far out stuff, the junk conspiracy is trying to basically contaminate the real research that is against the official story. And I think that's an important pattern to observe in all modern reporting.
Indeed. There's so many things from what you just said that we could continue with. But I've noted a couple of things. First of all, to your the definitions you're using here, very, very good. I've had similar thoughts, but not as organized and clearly as I think you've even baptize them with your own terms here. But what you call third force is usually what I've regarded as disinformation.
Yes.
But there's junk in the second step too, unfortunately, and that's what I refer to as misinformation, when people simply either they're intellectually lazy or they're just badly informed, or you often see that their emotions run amok. And so they get a little clouded perspective, and very often it's a psychological phenomenon that intelligence services hardly needs to do anything about. The fact that if you have a rather mainstream paradigm, and you do, realize something, people can have many moments that turns around the paradigm on specific issues. Like you mentioned 9/11, many people after 9/11 have waken up. But the problem is that they often lose their critical ability, because everything I thought was right is wrong, and the opposite.
Yes.
And then they buy into the wildest scenarios. And that's where we have a good market for misinformation. People who sincerely believe the most derailing notions, and doesn't do us any favors. And so you get also programs like, well, I don't want to mention anyone, but there is a lot of junk out there. So I think a very big problem is that people need to grow up, and they need to be able to distinguish between intentionally planted disinformations. But you mentioned CIA and intelligence services, and I think that I'm so amazed, actually, of that how they managed to get information out before the internet, like this book, CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, which is a paramount production, I think, in this literature. And, researchers and academicians as Carol Quigley. So I think you're right on track here, but let's entertain the darker side of this. You know as well as I do that many so-called journalists are on the CIA payroll.
Yes.
And the conspiracy thing is documented now to be a planted word that they used with huge success from JFK and onwards. But when it comes to handle dissidents, and not just dissidents, by the way, but anyone who threatens the status quo, they have a varied way to handle it. And one of them, at least in the olden days, was simply to make people disappear.
Yes. Oh, yes.
What about your own role? Are you ever? I don't know if I want to use the word worried here, but how do you regard your own safety, simply?
Yeah, right. I don't plan on disappearing.
or suiciding.
Right, exactly. I think it's an important thing to mention. Anyone who goes in to expose the types of things we're talking about runs the risk of being interfered with, and there are various levels of being interfered with. One of the classic cases, of course, is Gary Webb, who put out the fascinating book called Dark Alliance in the 90s. And that book was the blueprint, basically, for understanding how the CIA used the Contras and drug running in the late 80s for a variety of reasons. and to kind of influence Central America. But one of the things that happened to him was he got all the data out. And this is 1996, very early internet action here. Yeah. And when he started to run into problems, originally the newspaper he was working for in San Jose, they put out his stories, and it was causing quite a firestorm. As a matter of fact, the CIA director at the time had to come out to Los Angeles to, kind of give a meeting to the community to say, hey, this stuff isn't true. But in fact, Gary Webb had the goods on this. And so when his newspaper withdrew support from him, he quickly put all the stuff up on the internet. Very smart thing, and probably saved his life up to a point, because we know we lost Gary just a few years later. But one of the interesting things, I think, about what they did with him is they actually made it impossible for him to get a job after that. So, fired from the newspaper, moves into a small local newspaper, and the only thing they can give him there is classified ads. His name has just been dragged through the mud. And over and over again, we see these things. Now, a movie came out actually last year about this called Kill the Messenger, and, showing that over and over again, all the things that he brought up were proven correct over time, and even having sources inside the media saying, yeah, we actually took him down, And so there's so much in that story, and it's so powerful. But I think what happened with him, they said at the end, was that he committed suicide because it's a variety of reasons, but the important thing is that it was a very suspicious-looking death. Yeah. And this we see over and over again. In the early 90s, there was Danny Casolaro, who was killed over his octopus research, which got into the same types of forces. And these kind of deep state forces. So they don't like being examined. And if they get up to a point where they think you're going to really reveal something, then there's a program in place for sure. But I discussed this with Peter Dale Scott, who coined the term deep state and deep politics. And he really, his work, he's been so examined by the CIA and the NSA, and they have kept such surveillance on him that his attitude was he wasn't so concerned about the CIA and the NSA doing surveillance on his work as he was about the contractors that they outsourced to, like Booz Allen Hamilton, who are, acting kind of with no constitutional authority, and it's just a lawless group. And they may fudge details or do whatever because, they get paid more that way, or whatever it happens to be. But he felt that that was the real kind of abrogation of the Constitution there. So, that really represented a whole different level than just some federal agency looking at the work he was doing. I think when it comes to alternative research, you might see people trying to sway your research one way or another. And certainly there are dangers depending on the kind of story that you're looking at.
Yeah, it's not that long ago that an alternative journalist was killed. I forgot his name now, but it was a famous case. I think it was last year. Do you know who I'm speaking of?
Yes, well, there were several, actually. One of them had done a story for Rolling Stone, who had, he had exposed the Pentagon, basically their activities in Afghanistan, and actually got a general sort of taken off main detail there. So there were a lot of things that were going on in that story, and certainly it sounds like he was targeted and taken out, if you really look into it. However, there's also the story of the director, Ridley Scott, who had gone through this entire process of doing movies like Enemy of the State and really bringing this information out. And what happened really was that, under very, very unusual circumstances, he died. And they claimed, I have heard this, that he was working on a movie about drug running at the time. So, we have to wonder, I'm sorry, it was Tony Scott, of course. Ridley Scott is his brother. They're two famous directors.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's Tony Scott.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah,
yeah, I like both their movies a lot.
Yeah.
But, so we do see that if you're going to expose something like that, you do run into certain types of danger. What I see over and over again, however, in the alternative community is something I don't appreciate, which is people constantly claiming harassment left and right. that, you have to really understand that on the level of the work that you do, there's going to be a certain amount of electronic harassment or a certain amount of electronic surveillance from these intelligence agencies. But not everything that happens that goes wrong, like a flat tire or anything else, is that. And so I see that. So when I see that, very often, I say to myself, well, those people are starting to believe their own hype, So really, I keep it very, very clear. I think within the bounds of journalistic investigation, there are dangers, small and large. So I guess that's the best way to answer your question.
Yeah, keeping your feet firmly placed on the ground is important, because I think one of the programs they have is to drive people crazy. That's the best way to discredit them. They don't have to take the bother of killing them. When you mentioned directors, I was also thinking about De Palma, because Hoagland has more than intimated that there was foul play there, because his brother was into some research that is in the area of what Hoagland and Farrell and others have talked about. So, yeah, nobody is safe here.
Yeah, well, I think, it's Kubrick that you're talking about?
No, it's not Kubrick. It's, what's his name? The brother of Brian De Palma was famous physicist.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about directors who were killed. It's his brother was a physicist who was killed. I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just an association to what you were talking about.
Yes, yeah.
Brothers and directors. But the thing is that his brother put stuff in his movies.
Yes.
And he's more than indicated the fact that his brother, went away from this plane for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, because that's important. I think it's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Hollywood and the media are both thoroughly infiltrated by intelligence groups. Let's not make any mistake about that. That's not a conspiracy theory. I can actually document it. We can document it from the 70s with Carl Bernstein's famous article in Rolling Stone. The CIA admitted to having 400 paid assets in the media. Then, you might notice after 9/11, everyone who was a consultant suddenly on CNN is a Homeland Security person. How did that happen? Then, recently, actually, is a very important disclosure, and it's been missed, and I want to point this out. It's on globalresearch.ca. But this is a major figure in the German media who has a terminal illness and came forward saying that he planted a number of stories for the CIA in the German media. This is a story I think that should be followed up on, but there we can easily document what we're talking about. So the point is, why are they doing that? They want to obviously sway public opinion for certain reasons, and they don't want people's curiosity to go into certain areas where they become vulnerable because of their activities, which are very often black budget activities that are illegal. These are black operations and things that they're doing they don't want to be accountable for, but we definitely have to hold them accountable. So, I think what's important about all that is to understand the infiltration and how total it is. Whether it's a show like Homeland, for example, a very popular show on HBO, or some of these movies, winning the Academy Award that are about heroic CIA people in the 70s. And don't get me wrong, there are courageous...
What about this hit piece about this sniper, the guy who was completely out of order versus Jesse Ventura? They tried to portray him as some kind of hero when it's obvious that he was one of the biggest, most crazy crooks.
Yeah, well, this is Chris Kyle and...
Kyle, typical ordered programming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, his great claim to fame was to be this kind of vicious sniper and in Iraq. And the blurring lines here, the CIA, all these intelligence groups and a lot of the covert ones have great storytellers. Really some of the best. I mean, even E. Howard Hunt had many novels to his credit. They have great imaginations. That's why these guys get chosen, because very often a lot of the disinformation campaigns they use require incredible imagination.
James Bond,
exactly.
Early example.
Yes, there's no question about it. And I think when you look at those stories, you see that not only do they have great understanding about how the human psyche works, But, Ian Fleming is who you're talking about. He really was able to show that this incredible control over, details and situations and scenarios. And that's the kind of thing that they have in disinformation. They have to be the best storytellers on the planet. That's why they get into trouble. We talked about some of the really big events, like the JFK assassination. The initial story was well painted out, but it always looked funny. There were problems, a lot of problems on the ground with that story that made it fall apart. But the actual story, the setup of this patsy who was like a Russian sympathizer, Cuban sympathizer, disgruntled and all that stuff, shooting the president from Texas School Book Depository and, the Secret Service being caught off guard, all that whole thing, and then him being eliminated by Ruby. And, they painted all these scenarios that whenever you look into those scenarios, they all fall apart. But the stories, the mythological template that they're using is something that they've used over and over again. And you can see how they put these stories together. They use archetypes, the disgruntled loner. How many times does that come up in a false flag story? They always seem to find these guys. Sirhan happened a few years later, past that incident. He was the same type of deal, except he was even better because he just wiped out his thinking so that he didn't remember what he was doing at all. So they certainly have these techniques. The point is, we have to be able to read between the type of information that comes out through the CIA. It's not like the CIA and the media sit down and say, hey, I'm going to run this story through you. They very often can even present to these newspapers, hey, this is the story, you're getting an inside source, and feed them what they're looking for. So, there are areas where in the media they have extreme vulnerabilities to gullibility, never mind being in cahoots. So there's a whole kind of reform in the media that needs to happen about how they look at this wave of information that they get from intelligence services.
Yeah, we need to catch up, because catching up is so important, because like I discussed with, we didn't have time to explore it in depth, but I must say Richard Dolan is a brilliant thinker, because he can touch any of these subjects we've discussed easily. In fact, right now his next book he's researching is going to be on false flags. So it's refreshing that he's moving into a new area, which is very untapped so far, but he brings his scholarly attitude there. But my point is, like he indicated too, they're so developed now. If you look back at JFK and the older, the lone gunman nut meme that they are planting in us, because what you're talking about is the same thing as Mr. Farrell is calling social engineering.